There is a civilization that was forgotten for 4,000 years. Not erased by conquest. Not buried by a single catastrophic event like Vesuvius burying Pompeii. Not hidden in a desert canyon like Petra or sealed in a jungle like Anka. Simply, forgotten. Absorbed back into the landscape. Its cities buried under the silt of the rivers that had fed them, its writing sealed in an unknown script that nobody alive can read, its people dispersed into the populations of South Asia where their genetic legacy persists in hundreds of millions of living human beings who had no idea that their ancestors had built, 4,000 years ago, one of the most extraordinary urban civilizations in the history of the ancient world. The Indus Valley Civilization. Also called the Harappan Civilization after Harappa, the first of its great cities to be excavated. Also called the Indus-Sarasvati Civilization after the two river systems whose floodplains supported it. A civilization that at its peak, between approximately 2600 and 1900 BCE, covered an area of approximately 1.5 million square kilometers, stretching from the foothills of the Himalayas in the north to the coast of the Arabian Sea in the south, from the borders of present-day Iran and Afghanistan in the west to the plains of what is now Uttar Pradesh and Haryana in the east. An area larger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. With a population estimated at between 3 and 5 million people, making it the most populous civilization on Earth at the time of its peak. Whose cities were more carefully planned, more hygienically engineered, and more democratically organized, in the specific sense of showing no evidence of the extreme social stratification that the royal palaces and the monumental temples of Egypt and Mesopotamia express, than any other ancient civilization. And whose writing system, the Indus script, preserved on approximately 4,000 surviving seals and tablets and objects, has not been deciphered. Not by the most sophisticated computational analysis. Not by the most brilliant philological minds. Not by comparison with known ancient scripts. Not yet. The Indus Valley Civilization is the only one of the 4 great early civilizations of the ancient world, the others being Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt, and ancient China, whose written record we cannot read. What its people called themselves. What language they spoke. What they believed. What stories they told. What their rulers were called if they had rulers. What their gods demanded. All of it sealed in a script of approximately 400 signs that has resisted every attempt at decipherment for a century. It is the greatest unsolved puzzle in the history of archaeology. And it was entirely unknown to the modern world until a British railway engineer named Alexander Cunningham stumbled across the first evidence of it in 1872, and even then did not understand what he had found. The specific story of how the Indus Valley Civilization was discovered is one of the most dramatic and most instructive in the history of archaeology. Instructive because it involves the specific collision of colonial infrastructure development and ancient heritage, the specific way that building railways across South Asia in the 19th century both destroyed ancient sites and accidentally revealed them, and the specific intellectual journey of a generation of archaeologists from the first confused encounters with ancient bricks to the gradual recognition that they were dealing with something far older and far larger than anything in the existing understanding of South Asian history. Before the discovery. Before the railways and the archaeologists and the scientific excavations that gradually revealed the scale of what had been hidden for 4,000 years, the landscape of the Indus Valley and the Punjab plains was not empty of the civilization's traces. They were everywhere. The mounds of Harappa and Mohenjo-daro and 100 other sites were visible features of the landscape, known to the local populations who farmed and grazed and lived in their shadows, known in some cases as the remains of ancient cities whose names and histories had been forgotten. The bricks were known. This is the specific detail that makes the story of the Indus Valley Civilization's rediscovery both dramatic and melancholy simultaneously. The fired clay bricks that the Harappan builders had made in standardized sizes and in quantities so enormous that they had been used as a free building material by every subsequent population that lived in the vicinity of the ancient cities for 4,000 years. When the British East India Company began building the railway network that would eventually cover the Indian subcontinent in the 1850s and 1860s, the engineers who surveyed the route between Karachi and Lahore discovered that the most convenient source of ballast for the railway trackbed, the crushed stone that stabilized the wooden sleepers under the rails, was not stone at all. The plains of the Punjab had no quarries. But they had an apparently inexhaustible supply of ancient fired bricks, available for free in the mounds that dotted the landscape, requiring only the labor to dig them out and break them up. Approximately 160 kilometers of railway track between Karachi and Lahore was ballasted with ancient bricks from the ruins of Harappa. 160 kilometers. The specific scale of the destruction of one of the most important archaeological sites in the world, conducted by workers who understood that they were digging ancient ruins but had no framework for understanding their significance, is one of the more sobering episodes in the history of archaeological heritage. In the rubble of the brick digging, a railway engineer named John Brunton found something that was not a brick. It was a seal, a small carved stone object bearing an animal image and symbols in an unknown script, and he noted it as curious and passed it along. Other workers found other objects. A local antiquarian collector named Charles Masson had been collecting artifacts from the Harappa mounds since the 1820s and had included seals from the site in his published descriptions of the region's antiquities, noting them as unknown and interesting without understanding their significance. Alexander Cunningham, the founder and first director of the Archaeological Survey of India, the institution established by the British colonial government to survey and protect the archaeological heritage of the subcontinent, visited Harappa in 1872 and 1873, examined the site, described the mounds, and correctly concluded that the site was ancient. He identified a seal bearing an animal and symbols that he recognized as not belonging to any known ancient South Asian script, noted it as potentially significant, and moved on to the more immediately legible sites of the historical Buddhist and Hindu traditions that were his primary focus. He estimated the site's age at approximately 2,000 years, roughly half of its actual age. He had no conceptual framework for understanding that the bricks being used as railway ballast were 4,000 years old, because the prevailing understanding of South Asian history in 1873 did not include a civilization this old, this large, or this sophisticated. The oldest urban civilization in South Asia was believed, at the time of Cunningham's visit, to be the Vedic civilization. The culture associated with the Sanskrit texts of the Rig Veda dated to approximately 1500 to 1200 BCE, which was itself not a heavily urbanized culture. The conceptual revolution required to recognize the Indus Valley Civilization for what it was did not happen in 1872. It happened 50 years later. The man who made it happen was John Marshall, the Director General of the Archaeological Survey of India from 1902 to 1928, and the archaeologist who authorized and oversaw the systematic excavations at Harappa and Mohenjo-daro that produced the specific accumulated evidence of a civilization so unexpected and so extraordinary that its announcement to the world in 1924 generated the same specific electric shock of recognition that Tutankhamun's tomb had generated 2 years earlier. Marshall was not primarily an Indus Valley specialist. He was a classical archaeologist trained in Greece and Rome whose primary interests in India were the Buddhist and Hellenistic sites of the northwestern frontier. But he recognized in the seals and the artifacts that his survey was accumulating from the Punjab sites something that demanded systematic investigation, and he authorized the excavations, at Harappa under Daya Ram Soni beginning in 1920 and at Mohenjo-daro under Rakul Das Banerjee beginning in 1921, that produced the specific physical evidence of the civilization's existence. Daya Ram Soni was an Indian archaeologist whose work at Harappa, conducted with the specific methodological thoroughness of a trained professional rather than the treasure-hunting approach of earlier excavators, began to reveal the specific urban infrastructure of the Harappan city in systematic detail. Rakul Das Banerjee was another Indian archaeologist whose work at Mohenjo-daro, the larger of the two principal sites, located approximately 600 kilometers southwest of Harappa in what is now Sindh, Pakistan, produced the specific accumulated evidence that Marshall needed to make the announcement that changed South Asian history. Marshall published his findings in the Illustrated London News in September 1924, in a 3-page article with photographs of the excavated structures and the remarkable small finds, announcing that his survey had discovered a new civilization in the Indus Valley that was at least as old as the earliest known civilizations of Mesopotamia and Egypt. The announcement was received with the specific astonishment that genuine paradigm shifts produce. The academic community had simply not anticipated the existence of a third major urban civilization of the ancient world, coeval with Sumer and the Old Kingdom of Egypt, in the plains of the northwestern Indian subcontinent. What the subsequent century of excavation and scholarship, conducted at approximately 1,000 Harappan sites across an area covering parts of present-day Pakistan, India, and Afghanistan, has revealed about the Indus Valley Civilization is one of the most fascinating and most puzzling stories in the entire history of ancient archaeology. The cities. Mohenjo-daro at its peak housed approximately 40,000 people, a large city by ancient world standards, in a planned urban environment of extraordinary sophistication. The city was laid out on a grid, streets running north-south and east-west, intersecting at right angles, with the major streets wide enough for two-wheeled carts to pass each other. The houses were built of standardized fired brick. The Harappan brick had a specific length-to-width-to-height ratio of approximately 4:2:1 that is almost identical to the proportions of modern brick, arranged around central courtyards, their doors opening onto side lanes rather than the main streets, providing the specific privacy and acoustic insulation of an inward-oriented architecture. The drainage system. This is the feature of the Indus Valley cities that most consistently astonishes modern visitors and modern scholars, the specific sophistication of the urban sanitation infrastructure that the Harappan builders installed across their cities and that represents the most advanced urban drainage system in the ancient world by a very considerable margin. Every house in Mohenjo-daro had a bathroom. Every bathroom drained into a covered brick drain that ran beneath the lane in front of the house, connecting to a larger covered drain beneath the main street, which connected to the city's main drainage channels that carried waste out of the city entirely. Inspection ports allowed maintenance workers to access and clean the drains. The specific public health infrastructure that the Harappan civilization maintained, 2,000 years before the Romans built their famous sewers, was not matched by any other ancient civilization. The Great Bath. The most spectacular single monument at Mohenjo-daro, and in some respects the most debated, is the Great Bath, a large watertight pool approximately 12 meters long, 7 meters wide, and approximately 2.5 meters deep, built of fired brick sealed with bitumen waterproofing, surrounded by colonnades and changing rooms, supplied with water from a well and drained by a covered outlet. It is the oldest public water tank in the ancient world, and its specific architectural character, the colonnades, the changing rooms, the evidence of careful access control, suggests a ceremonial or ritual function rather than a merely practical one. It resembles, in striking ways, the ritual bathing tanks that are still found at Hindu temples throughout South Asia today, and many scholars have argued that it represents the earliest evidence of the ritual bathing tradition that has been central to South Asian religious practice for 4,000 years. The absence of monuments. This is the feature of the Indus Valley Civilization that most distinguishes it from its contemporaries and that has generated the most scholarly debate. Mohenjo-daro has no royal palace. Harappa has no royal palace. Neither site has a monumental temple of the kind that dominates the skyline of every major Mesopotamian or Egyptian city. There is no Egyptian pyramid equivalent, no Mesopotamian ziggurat equivalent, no structure that announces, in the specific visual language of monumental architecture, the existence of a ruler whose power commands the resources of thousands of workers and whose divine authority justifies the expenditure. This absence has been interpreted in multiple ways. Some scholars argue that the Harappan state was governed by a merchant oligarchy rather than a divine king, a commercial elite whose power was based on control of trade rather than on military force or religious authority. Some argue that the rulers existed but expressed their authority in ways that have not been archaeologically identified. Some argue that the Harappan civilization was genuinely more egalitarian than its contemporaries, that the absence of palaces and monuments reflects a genuine difference in political organization rather than a gap in the archaeological record. The weapons. The Indus Valley Civilization has produced no weapons of war. Arrowheads, yes, hunting weapons. But no swords. No spears of a military type. No depictions of battle or conquest in the art. No fortifications of the type that military defense requires. The walls that surround the Harappan cities appear to be flood control structures rather than military fortifications. The civilization that dominated an area larger than Egypt and Mesopotamia combined for 700 years appears to have done so without maintaining a military establishment. The trade network. What the Harappans were doing, in considerable quantities and across enormous distances, was trade. Harappan goods have been found at sites across the ancient Near East, including the major cities of Mesopotamia. Harappan weights, standardized to a specific system of ratios, have been found at sites across the Harappan world, suggesting a commercial infrastructure of extraordinary consistency. The specific standardization of weights across a civilization covering 1.5 million square kilometers represents a commercial regulatory achievement of remarkable sophistication. The script. The Indus script, 400 or so signs, preserved on approximately 4,000 objects, most of them seals, has not been deciphered. The specific challenges of decipherment are formidable. The texts are short. Most seal inscriptions are 5 to 10 signs long, providing very little text to work with. There is no bilingual inscription equivalent to the Rosetta Stone. The underlying language is unknown. It may be a Dravidian language ancestral to the modern Dravidian languages of South India, or it may be a language that has no modern relatives. The specific combination of short texts and unknown language and no bilingual key has defeated every decipherment attempt for a century. The decline. The Harappan civilization declined between approximately 1900 and 1700 BCE, a decline that was not uniform across the civilization but was most dramatic in the urban centers of the Indus Valley proper, where the great cities of Mohenjo-daro and Harappa were progressively abandoned while the eastern sites of the Gagahakra Valley maintained urban occupation for longer. The causes of the decline are as debated as everything else about the civilization: climate change, specifically the weakening of the monsoon that the paleoclimatological evidence shows occurring in the same period, disrupting the agricultural base. The eastward migration of the river system itself, epidemic disease, the disruption of long-distance trade networks, the arrival of the early Indo-Aryan-speaking populations from Central Asia, have all been proposed and none has been accepted as the single definitive cause. The most likely answer is that the decline had multiple causes operating simultaneously, the specific complex systems failure of a sophisticated urban civilization that had developed in the specific conditions of the Indus floodplain and that could not adapt quickly enough when those conditions changed. The cities were not destroyed. They were not burned. They were gradually abandoned, the population moving eastward and southward, dispersing into smaller settlements, maintaining elements of the Harappan cultural tradition in ceramic styles and in the specific ritual practices that may be the ancestors of later South Asian religious traditions. They left their bricks, and their drains, and their seals, and their writing that nobody can read, and the extraordinary legacy of a civilization that was, in the specific democratic and hygienic and commercially sophisticated ways that matter for human welfare, arguably more advanced than any of its ancient contemporaries, and that is still giving up its secrets, one excavation at a time, in the alluvial plains of the Punjab and Sindh and Gujarat and Rajasthan. The script will be deciphered. Eventually. The computational tools exist that did not exist a generation ago. The corpus of known Harappan text is growing with each excavation. The comparative linguistic framework for the possible underlying languages is more developed than it has ever been. When it is deciphered, when the 4,000 seals finally speak the language that a civilization of 5 million people use to record their world, the specific intellectual shock of hearing a 4,000-year silence broken will be the most extraordinary moment in the history of South Asian archaeology. The Indus Valley has been waiting 4,000 years to tell its story in its own words. We are still waiting to hear them.